Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Tamsin Rose, the Senior Fellow for Health at Friends of Europe, and welcome to this conversation about building strategic independence for the European pharmaceutical industry. Life sciences for Europe are a jewel in our industrial heritage, built in scientific excellence and in discovery and our manufacturing capacities. But the last 2 years have been a sharp wake-up call. In fact, we're starting to understand that shortages of medicines are a chronic, long-standing problem that affect all our health systems right across Europe. And this isn't just something that is happening behind the scenes, because almost 50% of patients, when asked, identified that someone in their family had experienced a shortage of medicines. And we're finding shortages in areas like painkillers, antimicrobials and antibiotics, as well as oncology drugs. So these range from the very generic and very inexpensive things that we would expect to get even over the counter in pharmacies, to the high-end medicines that are needed in very complex and sophisticated care in hospitals. So we really need to address this. And over the last 2 years, again, we've had this wake-up call to understand how important and how strategic the life sciences and pharmaceutical industry is to Europe. And we're going to discuss in the next hour how different approaches, how the EU is getting to grips with this, how member states are addressing it, and also how industry and other players are understanding this new approach and trying to make sure that in the future we'll have systems that are resilient, that we won't have shortages and we won't be subject to some of the major concerns that we had as a result of the pandemic. And looming over us today, of course, we have the debates in the European Parliament that are happening on the third package of sanctions linked to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And this will also have a disruption on our supply chains, right on our borders, not least because Russia and Ukraine are very well integrated in our clinical trials process. So we'll discuss a little bit of all of those different issues, but let me just invite you, the participants, to play an active role in this conversation. If you're on social media, the hashtag to use is FoEDebate, and we'll put that in the chat. I have a number of fantastic speakers who will just put a few messages out there, and then we're going to have an engagement with you. So please put your questions in the chat. Put your name and your organization and your question, so I'll be able to bring you in at different points. You can, if you want to say something, please raise your virtual hand or write it in the chat so I see if you want to be brought in. I'm going to start by setting the scene. I'm going to invite Thyra de Jongh, who's the principal consultant from Technopolis Group. Now, you led the recent report on future-proofing pharmaceutical legislation, a study on medicine shortages that was published at the end of last year. Can you tell us what that report showed us? What did you learn from it, and what are the key recommendations that will frame our conversation? Thyra, go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tamsin, for that introduction. And thank you all to the organizers for today's event for inviting me. Indeed, I'm very pleased to be here because, as Tamsin just said, today's topic is extremely timely and relevant. Pharmaceutical supply chains are an essential component of modern healthcare. And for patients, access to a stable and sufficient supply of medicine really does make the difference between sickness and health. But unfortunately, in many countries, patients are regularly confronted with stockouts or delayed access to the prescribed medication. And the COVID-19 outbreak made it all more apparent that there are vulnerabilities in our supply chains. So it's not a surprise that medicine shortages have been high on the European political agenda for some time now. So about 2 years ago, this was around the time that COVID actually first arrived in Europe, so not inspired directly by that event. My team and I started work on a study for the European Commission, for the Directorate-General Santé, to look into the issue of medicine shortages in the EU. Now, what they asked us to do specifically is to first prepare an inventory of notified shortages across the EU countries, look for trends in that data that would provide insight into what type of products are at greatest risk of being in short supply, and importantly, analyze the root causes of shortages. Furthermore, we looked at what tools the EU legislative framework currently offers to prevent or mitigate shortages and whether these tools are sufficient. Now, the overarching aim of this work was to develop a set of actionable recommendations for action to the EU and the member states. So to do this, we first compiled data from 22 EU countries from their official shortage registers. There have been other studies before us that have tried to do such cross-country analysis of shortages, but the data set that we worked with was the largest that has been compiled to date. We also extensively consulted with national authorities, industry representatives, pharmacists, healthcare providers, and patients to get their perspectives on the causes and consequences of shortages. Now, it's a big report, so in the few minutes I don't have time to go into all of the findings, but just five main takeaways to share with you today. First, not all shortages are equally problematic. Actually, quite a lot of shortages can be resolved fairly easily by substitution with a similar medicine, or the situation can be resolved fairly quickly before any real harm is done to the quality of care. Doesn't mean these shortages don't have a nuisance factor in there, they do, but at least therapeutically, the impact is limited. Second observation, shortages happen most commonly with either older or cheaper products or with more complex, innovative products. Now, in terms of the causes of shortages, what we noted is that about half of all notified shortages are attributed to problems that have to do with quality and manufacturing. Now, that's a very big catch-all, and unfortunately, the data that we worked with very often aren't very detailed. So it's hard to get to the real bottom of where in the production process the main problems and risks are. Some countries actually do have data on underlying problems with, for instance, the supply of APIs or raw materials, but a lot of the time that information is not available to the authorities, or at least it's not made public and we didn't have access to it. Now, fourth, another important cause is sudden increases in demand. And this points to a lack of resilience in the supply chain to absorb sudden demand surges, and COVID was a real example of that. Now, for me, the fifth, final, and most striking observation, that I want to share is that shortages are often quite localized. A product may be in shortage in one country, while there is still ample supply of that same product in other EU countries. And this suggests that in many cases there is a problem with how we in the EU distribute our medicines rather than with the actual global supply. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this, but it's heavily influenced by national policies and practices that influence how economically attractive a market is for suppliers. So in conclusion, our study showed that there are bottlenecks across the entire pharmaceutical value chain, from manufacturing to national pricing and procurement practices. And to address some of these issues, we developed a series of 16 high-level policy measures. I won't discuss them in detail, but overall they include measures that are aimed at distinguishing between medicines in shortages that are critical and those that are not so critical, so that tailored approaches can be developed to protect, in particular, the supply of most critical products. Second, to ensure that manufacturers adequately prepare for potential supply chain disruptions through planning and devising mitigation strategies, and that includes holding sufficient stock of critical products that can then be redistributed to where it is needed. Third, public authorities also should recognize and address problems with pricing and procurement practices that are in fact contributing to undiversified supply chains. And last, stakeholders should work together through open dialogue and transparent sharing of information to minimize the effects of supply chain disruptions. Now, for more detail and the full list of recommendations, I refer you to our report, which is available on the website of the Commission. And we know that right now these recommendations are under consideration as part of the ongoing revision of the pharmaceutical legislation. And like many of you, we will be very interested to see what comes out of that process and how those recommendations may be taken forward. And hopefully with that scene setting, we can move forward. I hand back to you, Tamsin.
Thank you very much, Thyra, and I appreciate that you've condensed down for us what is a very detailed report. And we'll put a link in the chat for those who are interested, if they haven't gone to download it yet, to find out more about this background. But I took a couple of points in there. First of all, that we shouldn't panic, in the sense that many of these shortages are a nuisance but resolvable. But they are areas that we need to look at, and also the issue that it is localized, meaning that this isn't necessarily a global supply challenge, but it's an issue about the way we procure and the way we distribute our medicines. And I think these are all areas where the EU can pay further attention and to work on it. Let me now invite you to a message that we have from Cristian-Silviu Bușoi, who is a member of the European Parliament and the chair of the European Parliament Committee on Industry, Research and Energy. And as I said, he's unable to be with us because he's actually chairing the committee meeting this afternoon, an emergency meeting on the third package of sanctions against Russia. But he recorded for us at lunchtime this message. So let's watch what he has to say.
Good afternoon, and sorry for not being able to participate due to the agenda of Industry, Research and Energy Committee that I'm chairing in the European Parliament. And we have a very important debate this afternoon on the third gas package revision. But it is also extremely important to discuss about building strategic independence for the pharma industry, because a strong union needs a strong industrial sector to promote competitiveness, create jobs and guarantee a high quality of life. And the European Union must support the development of sectors that are of strategic importance for Europe's industrial future, the pharmaceutical sector being one. In my view, the research and development pharmaceutical industry is an indispensable and critically important industry that the European Union must not do without. The industry in Europe is uniquely placed to play a key role in our economic recovery, our resilience and future growth, but only if the drivers of innovation are in place and if the appropriate financial support will be accompanying the upcoming legislative framework. COVID-19 crisis has clearly proven European Union's need for well-defined and adequately financed policy instruments, and this is what I envisage also for the upcoming pharma package review. But COVID-19 has revealed also shortages in the supply of equipment in hospitals, has deepened medicine shortage, and has revealed the need to reduce EU's external dependencies also in the pharma sector. Moreover, the pandemic has highlighted the need for boosting innovation and investing more in health in general. The pharmaceutical industry employs 830,000 people in Europe and directly contributes to more than 100 billion euros to the EU economy. Sustaining and growing pharmaceutical investment in Europe depends on creating a policy framework that supports the evolution of the region's innovation and manufacturing ecosystem, and an industrial strategy that ensures Europe's remain competitive in the face of intense competition from other regions and continents in the world. It's a long-term decision as to where innovation will occur. Will this take place in the Union or outside? And where innovation happens matters. It matters for the jobs, resilience and economic growth, and last but not least to patients, to health systems in member states and across the EU. Innovation is not an abstract concept. It means new diagnostics, new treatments, new vaccines that can transform the lives of patients and protect all population. The EU now has an opportunity to answer to these global challenges, but for that, a holistic EU approach is needed for the EU's pharmaceutical, industrial and trade strategies in coherence with other EU initiatives like the Intellectual Property Action Plan. These EU strategies are opportunities to drive Europe's health and growth. They are necessary to compete with other regions in the future, and also it is important in this competition for the development of new medical technologies and bringing innovation to EU patients and health systems. For the research-based industry in Europe, that means an intellectual property framework that protects investment in medical research in EU and globally, a research infrastructure that helps deliver the next generation of health innovation, a regulatory framework that is stable, fast, effective and globally competitive and faster, more equitable access to innovative treatments for patients across Europe. We have successes to build on. Over the last decades, we have seen the pharmaceutical industry respond to the incentives put in place at the EU level, and this precedent should be the basis of how we ensure the industry continues to direct research and innovation in the areas we as societies need most. Particularly the EU legislation on medicines for rare diseases and pediatric medicines has been a success story which we should be proud of as European and look to build on for the future. In my view, we should focus in terms of policies on strengthen global supply chains and keep them open, on reduce import dependencies by diversifying sources of supply, and create incentives for R&D and production in the Union in order to reduce dependencies on long term. These policies will increase EU's agility, competitiveness and pandemic preparedness, and help the EU to maintain its attractiveness as a global trade hub. The new EU Open sustainable and assertive trade strategy, revised EU industrial policy, and EU pharmaceutical strategy have the opportunity to all contribute to this strategic goal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bușoi, and it's great that we managed to get a message from him on this busy afternoon. Let me now invite Giacomo Mattinò to come in from DG Groote from the European Commission. And let me remind you who are watching us, we're interested in your comments, we're interested in your questions. Please put them in the chat or raise your virtual hand. We're interested in your views on this. The message here is about how we build strategic independence for the European pharmaceutical industry. And we've highlighted there some of the issues that we've learned through the pandemic, and also that study that highlighted some of the systematic issues that we need to do. So, Mr. Mattinò, let me ask you, what lessons can we learn from the supply chain initiatives that were brought in during the pandemic?
Yes, Tamsin, and all the audience, good afternoon. And then, first of all, of course, indeed, thank you very much for inviting me and for inviting such a distinguished group of speakers for this very interesting debate. I'll try, of course, to give you a broad perspective from the Commission, but since my role in DG Groote, of course, I will probably try to focus in these few minutes on the industrial aspects that are important in this debate. And let me also say that I think that your question and our debate today is very timely because indeed, as you said, the COVID-19 pandemic has reinforced, has made clear that we need to reinforce the need to increase Europe's strategic autonomy, and in particular for the health ecosystem. Now, it's clear that the pandemic revealed a number of shortcomings, from disruption of medicine or medical equipment supply chain to over-dependencies on third countries, but somewhat it was a wake-up call to ensure the resilience of our health ecosystem. We have heard already from Thyra, for example, that a number of the challenges were already known before the pandemic erupted. Now, I think that when approaching now this complex subject, we have to keep in mind and try, and in itself it's a challenge, to make a synthesis between, on one hand, public health, and on the other, industrial policy objectives, and they are not contradicting each other. It's important to keep borders open and address also the most pressing issues for the free movement of essential medical goods and services within our single market. So let me give you, and just to feed maybe further discussion and questions and interaction with the audience, just in a flash format, some examples where now the Commission has been working or is still working on. First, we won the battle of vaccine production. First, mapping our capacities, assessing and addressing supply chain bottlenecks, and triggering new industrial partnerships. So the results, I think, are there. The European Union is one of the world's leading producers of COVID-19 vaccine, and its supply chain are secured. We have produced more than 3.1 billion vaccines for our citizens and for the world. And I think this has emerged also from the summary that Thyra provided on the study, there will be probably other crises, and we have to prepare for the future in order not to be surprised. So we have been working quite hard, let me say, on improving our preparedness and ability to react quickly to future health threats. And the best example, and probably the first, but also best example that I can provide so far, it's linked to the launch in October last year of HERA, the European Health Emergency Preparedness and Response Authority, whose objective is really to improve the Union's developing, manufacturing, procurement, and distribution of key medical countermeasures needed in case of health emergency. For example, let me also cite that one very interesting and important element within HERA is to mobilize and deploy our industrial capacity through the so-called EU FAB project. This is one example, but another avenue which started, in fact, as somewhat I mentioned before the pandemic, is within the so-called structured dialogue on the security of medicine supply, initiated within the EU pharmaceutical strategy. And there, in addition to the study that Thyra mentioned, we have received from the first phase of the structured dialogue, quite a number of very interesting elements to reflect on. Maybe, if I may say, we were a bit short of our expectations in terms of data. Once again, let me refer to what Thyra mentioned. She captured also the challenge she and her team had in the study. Well, we are also noticing that there is a bit of a challenge in getting a solid, robust, comprehensive data on which to base, policy choices for the future. But in any case, we are working on that, and soon we are ready to come up with avenues, at least avenues for action to reinforce. Third example that I would like to very quickly mention is the fact that we are facilitating the development of important projects of common European interest, the so-called IPCEI. It's a state aid instrument, so this is mainly to support member states in pooling their investment efforts into breakthrough innovation when the market alone cannot do it. So this is mobilizing public and private funding for cross-border disruptive industrial projects, contributing therefore to the reaffirmation of our industrial leadership. Now, therefore, only 3 examples that I provided, but these are avenues on which we are working on. All what I've heard, in the intervention, also in the video message of the honorable member of the European Parliament, Mr. Bușoi, are relevant. We have many aspects that touch upon research, touching upon intellectual property, touching upon trade policy. I'm sure that probably during the course of our debate, we can certainly address more one or the other, depending on the question. But certainly all these elements are clear, and the response of the Commission is, on one hand, already there, and on the other, we are really working hard in order to, to set avenues of action that are as concrete and effective as possible. And let me conclude maybe with one remark. Clearly, the lesson learned. Well, the risk that we have seen also in the pandemic is that, being it at European level or global level, the blocks tend to close each other in maybe protectionist or excessive protectionist measures. This is not the case. We are fully aware that it's an open industry. It's a global industry when we speak about pharmaceutical industry, that the European industry is strong and open, and we have to keep this openness. So I would definitely support, when using the wording open strategic autonomy, this is what we are really aiming at. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giacomo. Very interesting there to hear you mention, of course, this new initiative, the IPCEI, which has just been launched by under the French presidency. I believe 16 countries have signed up to it. But I'm very struck by, you mentioned it's the pooling investment to make sure that we've got innovation that's affordable. But what came through very clearly from Thyra is that part of our challenge is in the sort of cheaper end of the market, the generics, the low cost, low value, where we just don't have sufficient manufacturing. And I'm wondering if the initiatives that we're talking about will pick up on that end. I'm inviting the audience at this point, if you've got questions or comments you'd like to make, put it in the chat. But Giacomo, if I could just ask you, obviously the new initiatives is looking at the high end, and of course, we've got issues of affordability, but really we're talking about painkillers here. We're talking about blood pressure medication. This is very basic stuff that is, I mean, Thyra said, it doesn't have much impact or therapeutic impact because we've got another solution for some of them. But isn't that a concern as well?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Tamsin. Well, certainly it is. And once again, let me maybe put the accent more on industrial policy challenges that on the medical aspects that are a bit outside my direct remits. But I think there, once again, I would like to underline that we have to take into account that this is a global industry. So when we speak about challenges, we have to identify, and let me underline once again, the intervention by Thyra, I think, was very, very to the point. In certain cases, we don't really have a huge problem of shortages. And on the other hand, we have to acknowledge also the fact that maybe in Europe, we are not able and will not be able to manufacture all products in the most cost-effective way. So it is an open, I would say, flow. We don't have to exclude the fact that in many cases, and I'm not only thinking of basic medical products, but it can be also for others. So it requires really a very careful analysis, that we might continue and we shall continue to have a very open flow. Diversifying, of course, the supply chain, making sure that we not depend from only one country or one region for our supplies. We have an excellent trade policy that is precisely taking into account those factors when we are negotiating either at multilateral or bilateral level, our trade objectives. So I think we have to keep in mind that we have to maintain a very open while reinforcing in very precise and defined areas our strategic autonomy. Thanks.
Thank you for that. And I note we've got an interesting comment in the chat from Gustavo Scotti di Uccio, who's highlighting for us that, the issue of interoperability and competition are important, but they may not necessarily be compatible. Because when you're talking about manufacturing, and we've had this whole conversation during the COVID vaccines, it's about the technology. And if you're going to have more shared capacity, there has to be a lot more sharing of information and data and process, and that can't necessarily happen in a competitive environment. So he's challenging us to look at our supply chains and say, if you want to have this sharing of capacity and skills, etc., don't forget that there's also a highly competitive environment. Let's see some more comments and input. I think we have the Perm Rep of Romania who's joining us in the conversation. I'm interested in picking up on the question of very localized shortages, and if this is an area that particularly affects some countries. Stefan Staicu, are you on connected? Maybe you could put a point in the chat or unmute yourself if you want to comment, if this is something that's particularly affecting your country and you want to share some input on this. We also have, I think, Benoit Moors, who's an advisor to Maggie de Blok, the former Belgian health minister, who might also share insight. We're trying to understand what's the impact of medicine shortages and how concerning is this for different countries? How much of this are they taking into account? Would either of you like to come in on that? We also have Nina Rawal, who's an investor in biotech and pharma, to get a sense also from her. When we talk about the sort of cheaper end of the market, what's the return on investment that will be required in order to have this diversification of different supply chains? Who might like to come in? Go ahead. Nina, unmute yourself, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Just jumping into this debate a little bit late, so I apologize if I am stating something obvious, but I think it's what I'm thinking about is really also the combination of the very cheap end of the spectrum, but also the innovative but affordable spectrum. How are we thinking about that as we talked about autonomy and strategic independence? Because the generics are the mainstay, but as we look ahead, we need to think about the innovative but yet affordable side of the spectrum as well.
Thank you. As you said, we need to understand the business case for investing in all different aspects. And of course, a lot of the headlines go in the more expensive, complex, sophisticated drugs, but we also need to look at that. I take medication for blood pressure, and I have experienced going to the pharmacy and they said, this medication is no longer available and hasn't been for months. And we've called the laboratory and they don't know when they're going to make it again. So it's something that's quite common across Europe, and we really need to get to grips with that, because when we talk about the supply chain, we're talking about secure, reliable, and accessible, and we need to be looking at all aspects of that. Okay, let me now bring in, we have a few more people who are going to just give us a few scene-setting measures before I go further into conversations with the audience. Let me invite Elke Groote, who's the head of EU relations for Novartis. We've talked about some of the challenges. We've talked about how pervasive it is. We've heard that it can be very localized. What do the supply shortages issues mean from your perspective, from an industry perspective?
Thanks, Tamsin. And thanks a lot for inviting me, and also for the insightful comments that were made before. So I'll try to give you in a few minutes the perspective of Novartis as a pharmaceutical company. So first of all, Novartis is a market leader in Europe, both in innovative medicines as well as in generic and biosimilar medicines through our Sandoz company. If you look at the global level, last year we managed to supply medicines to 766 million patients across the globe, including many patients also in Europe. And it was already referred to, but if you look then at our supply and manufacturing network as a company, this network operates globally. And our commitment to these 766 million patients to make sure that they get the medicine when they need it is very strong. That's why we as a company, we have robust business continuity plans in place. We make sure that we have safety stocks, not only for the medicines that we will supply to patients, but also for ingredients, active substances, and so on. And so, for example, for many of our products, we also have dual sourcing. So if one source comes under pressure, that we have the opportunity to go to another source. I mentioned that our supply and our manufacturing network operates globally, but we also have a very, very strong footprint in Europe. So most of our manufacturing sites as a company are actually located in Europe, including the last vertically integrated manufacturing site for anti-infectives in Austria, in Kundl. So a few points, as you asked me. COVID-19 was not only a stress test for healthcare systems, it was certainly also a stress test for us as a manufacturer and a supplier of medicines. And I mentioned the business continuity plans. All our sites have been operating in full capacity, even during COVID. Now, there were, of course, situations that made the manufacturing and supply of medicines more stressful and more difficult than under normal circumstances. For example, Thyra mentioned the demand peaks. We had some medicines like ICU medicines, medicines used in emergencies. We had some medicines where the demand went up with 300, 400%. And that was often not related to the fact that patients went up, patient numbers went up so tremendously, but we saw also the behavior of hoarding by hospitals, by regional authorities, by national authorities. And for us, it's very important to be able to basically supply all the patients in need. I sometimes say nobody is helped with huge amounts of stock in warehouses where none of the patients actually benefit from. So we saw these demand peaks, hoarding behavior. We were dealing with closing borders, with disrupted disrupted transport. And so what was extremely important for us at that moment was a good collaboration with all stakeholders, including EU institutions, to make sure that our medicines were reaching patients in need. So if you look at what have we learned from this situation and what would be our suggestions, let's say, for the European Union moving forward. First, I mentioned that we are market leader in innovative medicines as well as in generic and biosimilar medicines. And it was referred to already a couple of times. The situation on shortages is different when we look at innovative medicines and generic medicines. And one of the reasons that we see as a manufacturer is the fact that a lot of this off-patent business goes via tender business. Tender business, which is purely looking at price only. And we talked about the competitiveness of European-based manufacturers, but we strongly believe that moving systems from price-only tenders towards what we call smart procurement, where also criteria around environmental sustainability as well as security of supply are being taken into account when choosing a medicine, can actually make us as European producers more competitive. Thyra mentioned the localized issues. What we observe as an industry is that definitions on shortages as well as reporting requirements are different in every single country. This brings a lot of work, extra bureaucracy. So we are asking now that the European Union and the European Commission is looking into this, to make sure that there is a harmonized definition as well as shortage reporting requirements. It will not only help us and the medicines agencies, but it will also help to create a better view on where the shortages are actually located. In discussions like, for example, stockpiling, as I mentioned, stockpiling has only very limited value. At the end of the day, what is the most important is that we get the medicines to patients in need. For stockpiling, we have seen that many member states put in place mandatory stockpiling requirements, iron stock, and so on. We believe that this should be solved at the European level. Sorry.
I was just saying, great. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
So just inviting you to finish up your remarks.
Yes. So last 2 points I wanted to mention. We focus a lot on manufacturers, but of course, once the medicines leave our factories, there is a whole chain of distributors, traders, wholesalers, pharmacy chains. So the industry has been asking to use instruments that are available, like the European Medicines Verification System, to create a better view on where medicines are actually in the distribution chain. And I want to finish with what was mentioned by my colleagues before. Competitiveness of the industry goes hand in hand with public health. So what we need as a European industry is a strong, predictable, and robust regulatory and IP system to make sure that this industry can keep its competitiveness compared to other regions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elke. And let me now bring in Ruth Lopert, who's a senior health economist at the OECD, who can give us a bit of perspective within Europe, but also beyond, on this issue of medicine shortages. You know, what's happening elsewhere? Give us some context. Obviously, there's a world pre-pandemic and what we've experienced in the last 2 years. But what can you share from the research from the OECD?
Thank you, Tamsin, and thank you, Friends of Europe, for the invitation to join you today. I'm probably going to disappoint you all by saying I agree with much of what has been said till now, and it's consistent, particularly Thyra's remarks and also those of Elke are consistent with some of our findings.
We're having some difficulty with your microphone. Could you speak a little bit clearer, perhaps, or speak closer to the microphone?
Is that better?
Yes, that's much better. Thank you.
Sorry, it was fine before. Okay, so just to place the remarks in context, the OECD is undertaking a range of a number of pieces of work around the topic of health systems resilience. And this includes some work that we recently completed, which unfortunately will be published later this week, so it wasn't available in time for this discussion, but it was a review of medicine shortages across the OECD, and our findings are remarkably similar in many respects to those of the Technopolis report, though our data set was much smaller and our range of countries slightly different, because we looked beyond in a number of European countries and several outside Europe. There were some slight differences in our findings, but in particular, we noted that this was a very extensive problem well prior to the pandemic. In fact, across the 14 countries that we surveyed, the number of shortage notifications increased by 60% between 2017 and 2019, in fact. And we found across those 14 countries, we found a slightly different predominance of therapeutic areas that were responsible for the bulk of the shortage notifications in our survey. The medicines targeting nervous system, cardiovascular medicines, and anti-infectives were the most commonly banned drugs to be in shortages. But where our findings differ was that in 2/3 of cases, shortages of a given active substance were reported in more than one country, and many of them were reported in several countries at the same time. So we didn't see this same pattern of localised shortages, although I have no doubt that such shortages are not uncommon. The other key findings were that it's, as other speakers have said, that it's very difficult to undertake clear analyses of cross-national analyses of medicine shortages because of all the issues that have already been identified, differences in nomenclature, differences in perspective, differences in definition, differences in the ways in which notifications are made. And so it begs the question of the need for greater harmonisation, and not just across Europe. Global industry, global problem. We need some global harmonisation to actually gauge the extent of the problem and to identify the proximal and distal causes and to identify the appropriate responses. And so we have not made a specific recommendation in our report, but we will be going on to do further work in this area. And I asked the question whether there is a role for the International Conference on Medicine Regulatory Authorities to actually take on board this issue of harmonisation going forward.
Great.
Just a couple of other remarks. I agree, as I said, with Thyra's comments that in some ways that not all medicine shortages impact patients adversely, but in fact, the impact on patient health is actually very difficult to assess. As I said, we know that in some cases shortages can be mitigated, alternatives can be dispensed, and the major issue is inconvenience, but we really don't know the extent of the problem. The other thing is that because of the multifactorial nature of the issue and the complexity of the sector and the complexity of supply chains, actually clear root cause analysis is very difficult. We did find that shortages, as reported by marketing authorisation holders, were predominantly claimed to be due to exogenous manufacturing quality issues. But I would argue that not all manufacturing quality issues have their root cause in the manufacturing chain, but in fact are related to the issue of the race to the bottom in pricing and procurement that has led to unsustainable markets for older off-patent medicines. If you have an unsustainable market, then you probably have difficulty in sustaining manufacturing quality or maintaining availability of manufacturing capacity.
Okay.
So those are the key issues. I would say so that commercial factors and the policies settings that influence them seem to play a very important underlying role in propagating shortages, particularly for these off-patent products. but we do believe that more analysis is required. Following this particular report, as I said, which will be released at the end of this week, we are also undertaking, as part of the resilience work, we are actually looking at mapping some very specific supply chains, for doing some case studies to look at these specific supply chains for medicinal products likely to be needed in an undefined future health emergency. So, and to try to look at, to map the specific vulnerabilities of those, because I think it's important to recognise that medical supply chains are highly heterogeneous. Even within the same product, they can be highly heterogeneous, and it may not be sufficient to have, in quotes, generic approaches. And for some key products for future health emergency planning, we may have to make more specific recommendations. And we look forward to bringing that research forward later in the year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth. And you've highlighted that, you know, it's hard to really get to to grips with where the problem is. And we've had a comment from Thyra in the chat to say, you know, good policy requires good data. Without it, it's just speculation and best guesses. And Ruth, you've told us that, you know, that the sort of manufacturing process and supply chain, even within the same family of medicines, can be very heterogeneous. So we can't just say, well, this is the problem in oncology medicines, we need to do something different. So you've given us, I think, it's like when you put on a Facebook relationship, it's complicated. This stuff clearly needs much better data, and we need to have, that data needs to be clear to the regulators and also to the people involved in procurement, whether it's done at national level or even at hospital level. We heard about the dangers of hoarding and stockpiling, and even not necessarily medicines that were involved in pandemic response. But clearly what we saw was a breakdown of trust within the system, you know, a breakdown of trust, that people thought that if they needed to order something, they wouldn't get it, so they should stockpile it. So this stockpiling and hoarding issue, again, I think comes back to this message about the importance of data, making sure that we've got a harmonized definition to say, what is it we're talking about? What are we measuring? Then making sure that we're sharing that data, and that data is transparent both to the people involved in the purchase decisions and in the manufacturing. So I think this, you know, we have the European Health Data Space, and I don't know the extent to which it will cover some of these issues, but the importance on agreeing on the definitions and sharing the data is clearly something that we need to pick up on. We've got someone who's put his hand up who wants to come in. That's Gustavo Scotti. Would you like to make your comment? Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for this very interesting. Well, I have to clarify that I am a member of a company that is deeply involved in dual use, so military and civil. And I am also a member of the International Security Safety Global Strategy and Medical Maxi Emergency Management. So regarding the organization, somebody mentioned the supply chain, and I want to mention some lesson learned from the recent pandemic. As far as I know, but maybe that there are other countries, in two countries, Portugal and Italy, the government asked to the military organization to manage the supply chain for the vaccination. And apparently this was a success. Portugal, I think, hold the record of the number of vaccination. The question is, there is something that we can transfer from this experience in the new European regulation to solve the supply chain that was mentioned as an issue?
Thank you. And we also got a question from Sara Mundir to Giacomo from DG Groote about the IPCEI. You know, is there a potential competition between the strategic autonomy and strengthening of European manufacturers versus a push for breakthrough innovation? Because they're not quite the same. And it seems like, from what we see and recognize that the Declaration of Versailles has only happened in the last few weeks, that they're focusing on strengthening manufacturing. In other words, onshoring, bringing things back, rather than necessarily going for the breakthrough innovation. And that's interesting for this conversation. But Giacomo, I don't know if you could comment on that and the input we just had from Gustavo.
Certainly, thank you. Two interesting questions. Maybe let me start with the important project of common European interest and the question from Sarah. I don't think there is, if we approach it in, let me say, in a smart manner, I don't think there is a conflict or contradiction or competition between strategic autonomy and strengthening, of course, the European manufacturing versus a push for breakthrough innovation, because the two aspects can be, although with different features and different challenges to address, they can be part of the same, of the same picture, and we can certainly, I'm confident, we can find interesting solutions, or in any case, interesting policy actions to support both the elements, and IPCEI definitely is one of them. Clearly, the intention of member states seems to be in favor of strengthening manufacturing, but if we think manufacturing as only traditional manufacturing, I think we are not on the right path. Also, ways of manufacturing are and can be subject, and actually, I believe, are subject to very interesting, innovative developments. So let's not think only to innovative products, but let's also think to innovative manufacturing avenues. And the link with, for example, green objectives can be easily made. I don't think I have to spend too many words in that respect. Concerning the question by Gustavo, it's a very interesting one, although I think, Gustavo, you were referring mainly on supply of finished products. So the military intervened in Portugal and Italy when it comes to the supply of vaccines, of finished vaccines. Here, our preoccupation is more on the supply of what is needed to produce medicines and what is needed in the example of vaccines to produce vaccines. I think examples of what has been done from in the defense area to monitor and to reinforce supply chain is definitely an avenue to explore. And in order to support what I'm saying, I'm just thinking across the Atlantic. If you see the approach that United States had when it came to ensuring vaccine production, they used basically, I mean, it's not the only element, but let me just mention this example. They had recourse to their Defense Act to oblige manufacturing companies who were having manufacturing sites in United States to provide much more information on their supply chains that we can actually do in Europe. So, I mean, I just want to mention this example because I'm not defending the fact that actually we don't have the legal means in Europe to do exactly the same. So I don't think we can just copy what has been done by the US, but definitely this interlinkage on avenues and methodologies to identify criticalities and to monitor criticalities, elements that came out of the defense at large experience can certainly be of interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Giacomo. Catherine Kronaki from HL7, you've put in a question in the chat about the adoption of the SPOR and ISO IDMP. Now, not everyone's going to understand what that is. Catherine, can I invite you to just first explain to us what those things are, and then we'll see who from our panel could answer.
Sure. So there is an effort for a European medicines database, which is called SPOR, and it's a project by EMA. So the idea is SPOR stands for substances, P, that's S, P for products, O for organizations, and R for referentials. So this is an infrastructure which essentially allows us to identify in the same way medicinal products throughout Europe. One of the problems that I see, and I am an outsider, I'm only representing a standards organization here, is that if we want to really solve the problem of shortages, we need a way to identify in a harmonized way the medicines. So right now we have the database of EMA, and then we have the databases of the national agencies, which are not compatible. And this is for me an issue. Maybe some of the panelists would like to comment on that.
It's clearly an issue, and I think if we're not talking the same language and we haven't identified the same issue, we won't see what the problems are. Giacomo, I don't know if you're able to comment on that, or any other of our panel. I don't know, Thyra, if you can come in on this. Giacomo.
Well, for me, very quickly, and sorry, maybe to make a very, very general comment, but let's not forget that there are still limits to what can be done at European level to harmonize when speaking about or when acting in the health domain. Let's not forget, because sometimes, in the heat of the debate, I think we are forgetting that this is very much an area where the competencies of the European Union as such are fairly still limited compared to others, and the national dimension is very prominent. So, I'm not saying that to justify inaction, but on the contrary, it's a complicating factor that shall be accounted for.
Okay. Thyra, can you comment on this as well, that this message that, and you mentioned yourself earlier, how hard it was to collect data because data is categorized differently across Europe. And we just heard that there's an incompatibility between the EMA's agents' way it collects data, and of course they're going to have a new mandate, and the way national agencies do that.
It's a really complicated issue. Elke already mentioned the existence of the EMVS that industry has indeed been advocating for using. I also know that there are other parties in the system who very strongly oppose the use of the EMVS, considering the system not fit for purpose. I am myself not an IT specialist. I don't know the details of these systems sufficiently to tell you where the bottlenecks are or whether these could be resolved. I think the need for better data is clear everywhere. I think the willingness is there. Already the EMA has a shortage working group that has been working a lot on building guidance. They have developed a template for what sort of data national authorities should be collecting. But as just also said by Giacomo, the EMA, even with the expanded mandate, it can offer guidance, but right now it cannot enforce anything on the national competent authority. So it really is an issue here of what are we jointly willing to do? Do we recognize the importance of this? I think that recognition is there, but the EU itself is a complicated body to go from we agree that this needs to be done to we're going to do this now and this is how we're going to do it. That takes time.
Yes, and you've made the point that we now at a moment, I think, where the political engagement and the political commitment is very clear as a result of the pandemic. I said that right at the beginning, but we now need to make sure that it happens. The conversation we've just had reminds me of the conversation from the e-health, which was, in the beginning of the 2000s, where we started to talk about interoperability and say, are we all measuring things? Are we defining them in the same way so that there is some way that we can connect all of these different data? And I'm wondering if there are ways that we could take lessons from that, because a lot of effort went into making sure that data was collected in the same, was robust, and so that we could now use that data effectively. And I'm sure there's ways that we can build on the experience of that. And I'm curious to see how the European health data space evolves to take this up. We're coming towards the last few minutes of our conversation. Thank you very much for being in this conversation with me. And I'm going to invite, if there are members of the panel, that there's a final message that they would like to say. Elke, you put some things in the chat. Would you like to say anything as the final message you'd like to leave with the audience?
Thank you. Thanks so much. I think the discussion was really very interesting, and thanks for a fantastic moderation also. I conclude from today that we are on a track here. There is quite some collaboration ongoing and open discussion. Thanks also towards the European Commission and the other institutions for that. At the end of the day, we have one goal, and it's to ensure supply to patients in need. And it's a goal that every stakeholder that is active in supply of medicines shares. So it's good that we have finally the discussions, and we look forward to seeing a European level solution, and to avoid that, as some people in the comments also mentioned, that member states take a very nationalistic and protectionistic approach. Thanks.
Thank you, Elke. Let me just summarize, I think, where I think we've got to at the end of our conversation, which was very interesting. We first started off by understanding that this is a problem that has existed well before the pandemic, that we had regular shortages of different products that was perhaps invisible to some of the front-end users, whether it was a GP or a patient, because you had substitution, there was a use of other medicines, but it was consistently almost 50% of patients had felt it in some way in their family. So this is clear. It's across a number of different therapy areas, from the very basic painkillers and antibiotics right up to the complex molecules that are involved in oncology. We've understood that it's partly an issue of distribution. Some of these problems were local, so that there are also some issues around manufacturing. We've got some questions about how we procure medicines. We tend to have a process where we procure through a competition basis, and then the winner gets the contract and there's nothing for anyone else. So there's no incentive for the people who came second in a process to keep manufacturing and keeping that available. So there's a reflection about the way we go about this. We had some calls in our conversation to say it isn't just about price. We need to look about issues around green issues, energy use, carbon footprint, and maybe also about security of our supply chain, that we need to have smarter decisions about the way that we procure drugs. We heard about the very new development, the new IPSI that's been put together, a recognition by at least 16 member states that the pharmaceutical supply chain is a key part of our industrial base, and that we need to be able to make decisions to support it. We heard about the importance of getting the balance right between looking at the high-end, highly innovative, complex ones and the simpler molecules. We heard that Europe is part of a global chain, and there is questions about whether it's a distribution issue. And we heard the example from during the pandemic when the military was invited to be part of the distribution of finished products, but also we're highly dependent on our APIs, our active pharmaceutical ingredients in other parts of the world. Very specifically, India and China are the major source, and very heavily in areas around, for example, antibiotics, insulin, and painkillers. Very basic medicine that's used everywhere. And these are things that I think we'll have to reflect on more at European level. So I want to say a very warm thank you for joining us for this, the first of 3 conversations that we're convening around the issue of supply chain autonomy for Europe, looking at different aspects of our strategic approaches. I'd just like to remind you all that at Friends of Europe, we produced a report last year looking at the European health data space and how to make that work for rare disease patients. And we looked at some of these issues about, with rare diseases, I guess it's the same problem. The market mechanisms don't work because the market is essentially too small. So we made a series of recommendations, and I encourage you to look at that. We've also done reports in the past on disruptive innovation and how that works in the healthcare system. I thank you all for participating today, and I look forward to seeing you in our future debates. Thank you and goodbye.